Hey everybody, it's Ashley. In today's video, we are going to go over the basics of water bath canning. The recipe that I chose to can today is going to be a peach butter, which is something that I've not done before, but I canned a ton of peaches that is in my video just before this one. And I actually had some peaches that were a little too firm. I didn't want to can them up, so I let them sit out on my counter to ripen up for a few more days, and they are perfect now. And so I thought, let's do some peach butter and go over all of the little details for water bath canning. I've done a lot of other canning videos, but never really gone through basic step-by-step process. So what I'm going to do is I will show you all of my equipment that I have for today, and then I will prepare my recipe. If you don't want to watch the recipe, I'll have a timestamp so you can fast forward to when I continue sort of the actual canning process. Now, when we can, the water bath canning process is specifically for food that is considered to be a little higher in acid, and I believe the cutoff is right around 4.5, 4.6, something like that, in terms of like something that is low and high acid. I don't test the food, it's just sort of what a food is known for to be. And some of the foods that are kind of borderline can be things like tomatoes, and so sometimes those have a little bit of acid added just to kind of make sure that they're not too close to that low acid range. Other foods that are considered to be higher in acid are fruits, things like soft spreads and pickled foods. Basically what you're doing whenever you're processing anything in a canner, whether it's pressure canning, but that also includes water bath, is you are controlling yeast, enzymes, and mold. So it can either kill or inhibit the growth of those things. For water bath canning, what you're doing is you're basically using the temperature of boiling, which for Fahrenheit is 212 degrees. So the recipes are specifically designed to bring up the temperature all the way to 212 degrees, leave it there for a short amount of time. So when you're doing things like quarts, it takes longer for the internal temperature to reach that boiling point in the very center of every single jar. So that's why quarts are longer than pints, are longer than half pints in general. And a lot of times if there's thicker foods, those, or more dense foods, those can also have longer cook times. The other factor with regards to processing time, besides jar size, is your altitude. So anything 1,000 feet above sea level and below is what the standard recipe is typically made for. You can easily find altitude adjustment heights in canning books. I think they even have them if you buy little packets of pectin and things like that. They have altitude adjustments in there as well. But depending on where your house is altitude wise, there are ranges of time, and so the higher the altitude, the higher the processing time. Okay, so let's just take a look at my equipment and materials, supplies that we will be using today. Okay, so as my equipment, the first thing I'm going to mention is this blue book guide to preserving, and they put these out, I want to say like every 10 years or so. This one has gotten lots of wear and tear. I have taped the spine. There are pages where kids have scribbled, and all of that. But this is going to be a good, especially for starting out, this is just a really good resource. They do have like the Ball Complete Book of Canning, but this is all that's really needed. It gives a lot of really good basic information, talks just generally, just different things, learning about canning. There is the altitude adjustment section here, and they even have some really nice fold out pages with some instructions. So I mean, with some visuals, which can be really nice and helpful, and just sort of like a reminder and to kind of get your eyes on, okay, this is what this is what this is supposed to look like. This is great. And they usually have a couple of these per magazine. I think they have one for corn later in this book and everything like that. So because that would be with pressure canning. But that's a really great resource. I highly recommend it. I'm going to use my recipe for my peach butter out of here. And so we'll go through that in detail as I go through the recipe portion of the video. So the other things that I have today is a canning funnel, a jar grabber, and this is what I'm using as a debubbler. So whenever you fill your jars, it's important that you try to release bubbles that might be trapped either between pieces of food or just in the general mixture. And by using a debubbler tool of some kind, it helps to do that. And it just helps to create a better finished product. It helps to adhere to the recipe a little bit better. I don't actually have a debubbler, so I use this plastic portion of this spatula, even though there's this little loop down here. But you can use like a plastic knife if you have, or anything like that. A jar grabber is really helpful for specifically taking jars out of the super hot water. Sometimes if you don't have this, but you might have temperature proof, waterproof kitchen gloves, you can just go straight in with your hands and grab this. The thing that's really nice about these, however, is that it grabs jars below the ring and lid, so that when you, so you go like this and you grab it down here and you don't touch where the ring and the lid are sitting, and that's really important to not disturb that part. So if you were to be grabbing that with your fingers, you just want to make sure that you didn't grab the ring and the lid part. This is just really good to help prevent spills and things like that. I end up using that funnel for all different kinds of kitchen uses. And so I highly, highly recommend some kind of funnel. They're not that expensive. You can get them plastic, you can get them used. That one was, I don't know, maybe $5 or $7 or something like that. It's well worth it, even though it doesn't have the little like loop on it anymore. And so those are some of my basic canning supplies. In terms of equipment, well, of course, then my canner. I'm using my pressure canner. It's a really deep pot. You can double stack in this. I've never done that. Something I want to try, but I haven't done it. I have actually gotten rid of my Waterbath canner, and I use this for water bath and pressure canning. And even though I'm just going to be doing small jars, I don't actually have to put the whole thing full of water. As long as my water covers my jars by 1 inch, that's all. So I could use a smaller kettle than this. If you don't have a canner, or you can't afford one, or you can't find a used one anywhere, you can use almost any other kettle. What's really important, like I said, is that you can cover your jars by at least 1 inch of water. And then what's also important is that they don't sit directly on the bottom. So canners have these racks that sit down there. The other day when I was canning peaches, I actually got another really big stock pot that I have out because I wanted to get it done. And so I used canning rings on the bottom of it so I could use that as a second canner. And even the water was really close to the top, but it worked beautifully, and I was really glad that I did that. So you can really make a canner out of most anything. I think a lid is also really important because it helps to bring the temperature up to boiling quicker and maintain it a little bit more. Okay, so then I have some water here to start my process with the peaches. For the peaches, I of course have the fruit, some sugar. I'm going to add some cinnamon and nutmeg to my butter, my jars, brand new canning lids, and canning rings. I have this just to measure my sugar, a spoon to stir the butter in my pot, and that's all of the equipment I have. I will also put a link to this. It might be a more current version of it, but I will try to put a link in the description for this, as well as these 2 items. I think they're already there, but I'll double check. So at this point, I will start the recipe portion of the video. For this peach butter recipe, all of the peach fruit cooked down into sort of a puree that is sweetened and sometimes spiced. In my case, like I said, I'm going to add the cinnamon and nutmeg because I think that sounds delicious. I think it's going to be basically like spreadable peach pie. It's kind of what I'm hoping. And I'm thinking, I've heard of apple butter, pumpkin butter. These are things that I want to try everything of this year because I've never really given them a good shot. I've had apple butter before and I wasn't like super crazy about it, but it was a store-bought one, and I think I can probably do better homemade. If you watched my peach canning video, you will notice that it's a very similar process. We are going to go ahead and drop the peaches right down into boiling water and leave them there 30 to 60 seconds. I find that the lower end of that seems to be plenty of time. And all this is going to do is get that skin to pull away from the bulk of the peach so we can slip those skins off. After your peaches have been in the water for that amount of time, you want to take them out of this hot water, which is about to overflow in my case. and you want to put them in very, very cold water. We got these peaches moved back to the kettle in cool water. I added the cool water they were sitting in and then just a little bit more so that they could all be submerged. Now that these are cooling down, they feel like they are cool enough to handle. I'm going to go ahead and slip those skins off, and you can see they're already starting to come off. This fruit was very soft, so this is the perfect day to get these canned up. One thing when you're canning, make sure that when you're picking your vegetables or fruit that they are at the peak of freshness and not overripe. Now that I have my skins off, I'm going to go ahead and sort of follow the same path that I do when I'm canning peaches, and because I just find that easier. So I'm just going to go ahead, cut them in half, and cut them up into small pieces. And then to remove the pit, I just sort of slowly break away the peach. And that's all I do. So I'm going to get all 7 of these peaches chopped up just like that. To start, I'm going to add just a little over a half a cup. Drizzle in some cinnamon. And if I think it needs a little bit more sweetness, I will add more sweetness. Nutmeg. And now I'm going to get this on the stove and allow it to reduce. Okay, this absolutely does smell like peach pie. It smells so good. So I'm just stirring it occasionally, just making sure it's not sticking, waiting for the fruit to kind of break apart and the whole mixture to thicken. In the meantime, we're going to get our canner filled with the amount of water that we need and get it warming on the stove. I know some people use an immersion blender or put this mixture through a food processor, but I'm going to try first mashing it up with this masher and just see how small and fine I can get it. I can already tell that it's getting thicker, and I think this is probably going to work just fine. So I'm going to really go in there with both my hands and really try to mash things up into a really smooth consistency. Okay, some of the pieces maybe are a little still, I don't know, stringy, maybe that's the right word to use. But in general, I think I did a pretty good job of making it a fairly even consistency. And so now from this point on, we should be able to just let this keep on reducing. And I think we are almost there. We have our water going in our canner. Shortly here, we will be able to get this into our jars. Okay, we are ready to start filling our jars. The peach butter is now boiled to a consistency that I like. And let me just kind of show you here. I think it's looking really good. Okay, so the next thing to think about, one of the important parts of the filling the jar step of canning, and this is water bath or pressure, is this thing that's called headspace, which is the amount of space between the very top of the jar and the top of your food. So every recipe will give a headspace measurement. This particular one says to leave a 1/4 cup headspace. And for me, when this ring is about halfway around, that's about a 1/4 cup. So it starts here, ends here, so about halfway around, that's going to be my 1/4 cup measurement, or just a little higher. My 1/2 cup measurement will be about at the bottom of this ring, and then the inch one will be just below this last ring that goes solidly all around the jar. So that's sort of a general rule that I used to follow. The ball book that I showed you earlier in the video, that has a wonderful reference that shows the picture of a jar, like a graphic of a jar, and where that headspace is. There's also these really handy headspace measurement tools that you can get, that if you're at all nervous about your ability to kind of gauge headspace, I highly recommend getting one of those. They also can be used as a debubbler, so it can kind of serve two different purposes. So my jars have been very thoroughly washed, which is a very important step in the canning process. I'm just going to place my canning funnel right on in, and I'm going to kind of judge that this part of my funnel is going to be about the top of the jar. So I'm going to give what I think is about a 1/4 inch of space, and that looks right to be about accurate. So when looking at this view of the side, the start of the ring, the start and end of the ring is right around here, and a little bit less than halfway around is right here, which is right where my peach butter ends. So that looks to be just right. So I'm going to go ahead and let's fill up the rest of these jars. And I do not have enough peach butter to fill my 4th jar, so I'm not even going to fill it at all. I'm going to put that in a smaller jar that we'll just put in our fridge and eat out of that. We are almost done. Really is a pretty straightforward process. So I have just some regular white distilled vinegar, and I'm going to put this on a paper towel. This is the last step before putting the lids and rings on. You just want to make sure that you go over the top of the jar where the lid gasket sits, where the rubber part of your lid will sit on the jar, and clean it. You can see I got a little something there. Clean it of anything that might be there, whether it's grains of salt, if it's something salty. In this case, I would be concerned about the stickiness of just the contents. Any chunks of food, anything like that you want to get off, so that this rubber piece, when it sits down on the jar, has nothing getting in the way of it sealing properly. So we just set those on there. And then I'm just going to, first I kind of go through and I gently just get these jars very loosely on. And then I go back and I just do a simple twist like that. They shouldn't be cranked on too tightly, otherwise the jar can actually poke through this little rubber seal, and then you have the jar just sitting straight on the metal. And this rubber seal is what creates that airtight environment that the jar and the whole food preservation process heavily relies on. So you want to make sure that you actually don't go too tight on that, but tight enough to where it's going to make a difference. So we're just going to go ahead and get these in our canner. Even though our canner water is not boiling yet, that's a good thing. This is hot. The water in the canner is hot. And then we will let the canner go up the rest of the way to boiling with these jars already in there. If the temperature of the jars is cold and you're putting that into hot water, like if the peach butter had cooled down too much and the jars were cold, that can cause the jars to break if they go into the hot water, just like if the peach butter was scorching hot, well, like it is, and the water wasn't at least on its way to hot like it is. That can also cause jar breakage. You just want to make sure that the temperature from one to the next is not too extreme. And that's the most important thing when it comes to the temperature of the jar and contents and the temperature of the water that's already sitting in the canner. So this is going to come to a boil. Once it gets to a rapid rolling boil, not just simmering or gently kind of bubbling and things like that, we want it to be a super strong boil. Then we start our timer. This peach butter is going to boil in this canner for 10 minutes. Once that comes to that super strong rapid boil, and then we set our timer and we start it 10 minutes. So we'll be back as soon as our water comes to that rapid boil point. You guys, I am so sorry. I completely forgot to debubble the jars. I went ahead and pulled them back out of the canner and debubbled them. And got them all back in, had to rewipe the jars. So important not to skip that step. So I'm just going to show you generally what you would do. I have this in just another jar that we use on an ongoing basis. So I usually just slide this in and slide it along the edge. And if it's something that doesn't have a lot of thick contents in it like this, you can kind of pull it towards the center and just kind of do that kind of motion. If there are contents, like when I do my pickles, I slide this along the outside edge and I just push to the center and kind of wiggle it, and you'll see the bubbles come up. So you this is something that you slide along the glass side of the jar, in between the glass and the food, and kind of push inward, and that removes bubbles and pushes them up and out. I know there's a lot of steam, but this is that rapid boil we were looking for. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start my timer for 10 minutes. So right now, I'm gonna pull this off the hot burner. I'm gonna pull this lid off, which is my least favorite part because it's always dripping with water. And now this is just gonna sit here off the burner for 5 minutes. And this is also part of just making sure that the temperature differences aren't too extreme. So this will give this a chance to just cool down ever so slightly, and then we'll get the jars pulled out of this hot water. So we already heard that jar seal on its way to its cooling down spot. I love hearing that popping sound. So whenever I pull jars out of the canner, I like to put them on a rag. I don't always have them layered like this, even just a single layer. Just a little buffer from the coolness of the counter is a good idea. There was our next one. But that buffer helps to make sure that they don't, cool down too quickly or get exposed to that cold counter surface. The reason that I did it like this is because that way it can be tucked in the back of this cabinet or this countertop, and won't really interfere with the rest of the activity that we might be doing today, utilizing this counter surface. So these jars will sit here until they completely cool down, and the general rule is 12 to 24 hours. Whenever I can, I always assume that the next day these will be cooled down, whether it's the morning or, I'll get to them later in the day, but I just leave them overnight no matter where or no matter what I'm canning. I just make sure that I have a place for them, that they will be able to sit completely undisturbed until the next day. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. In the morning, there was our third one. In the morning, we will be back to do our final steps, getting these prepared for storage. We are here the next morning, and I am going to take my rings off and get my jars prepared to be stored. So obviously taking the rings is the first thing you want to do. And I'm pretty pleased with my set. I think it's not, you know, it's not super gelled, but the stuff that I had extra of that was in the fridge is even more gelled. And so that's gonna be just fine. I am totally fine with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these jars washed with warm soapy water. I like to pay particular attention to all of the threaded parts of the jar, just to make sure that all the little areas on that don't have any sticky food left on them. And this may seem like a tedious process, but trust me when I say you don't want to come down to your hard work and your stored food to find any kind of mold growth on the outside of the jars because there was food residue. And then I label them. You can put the year or the actual day that they were made, especially if you make a lot of this, or if you think this will be on your shelf for more than a year. I do not anticipate that ours will be. Plus, this is such a small batch that I'm sure we will go through it in a great amount of time. I have been thinking so much over the last day about what I can use this for. And I'm thinking this could be just a nice dollop in oatmeal. This could even be used for part of like a marinade. I mean, you don't just you could put it on toast. It could be something simple like that, maybe with some cottage cheese or ricotta cheese, or plain. I mean, there's just so many biscuits. There's so many different ideas that I think that this is probably not going to be near enough for all of the ideas that all the things that I would like to try it on. So who knows, maybe we'll end up making more of this, but for now, I think I wanted to make a small batch because I've never tried this recipe before. And I wanted to kind of walk you through the canning process. So I didn't want to do, you know, something that was too extensive in terms of a large quantity of jars. So there we have it. And the last step is going to be to put this in storage. So let's bring this down to our basement. Okay, here on this shelf, I have a lot of my jellies and jams. Well, all my jellies and jams. I have some sweet pickled relish, and then also my mustard behind that. And so I'm just going to store the peach butter right in front of my orange rhubarb jam, keeping canned goods in a cool, dry place is really important. You don't want any moisture to start to deteriorate your lids. You don't want too much light and heat on these things. Too much heat, especially above 90 degrees, can actually really start to deteriorate your food product. So you want to make sure that it stays in a really nice cool place, ideally below 75 degrees. And so this is just a perfect environment down here in our basement for these canned goods to stay well within their year, if not much, much longer. Thank you for coming along as I take you through the canning basics that I was able to show you today and the making of this delicious peach butter. If you'd like to see more canning videos, more food preservation, more videos on being self-reliant and things you can do to be self-reliant, please subscribe. I hope you have a wonderful day and we will see you soon.